If you were alive in 1914 and you were to place a bet on where genocidal fascism would occur, you almost certainly wouldn't bet on Germany. In fact, there were many ways in which Germany was fairly liberal. It had universal male suffrage. All men over the age of 25 had the right to vote. The largest party in the German parliament was the left-wing Social Democratic Party. It also had one of the biggest trade union movements in Europe. Germany would also have seemed far from the most anti-Semitic country. The most dangerous country to be a Jew was probably Russia, where there were regularly anti-Semitic massacres known as pogroms. Despite all that, it was in fact Germany that would see the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. It was from Berlin that the worst genocide in history was orchestrated. That then raises the question, how did it happen? How did Germany go from being a moderate, liberalising state to the birthplace of Nazism? How did Hitler go from being an absolute nobody to having absolute power? Of course, there are effectively an infinite number of things that we could talk about, but in this video I've tried to break it down to 6 main ideas. 6 big factors, all of which played a key role in bringing the Nazis to power and sending Germany down its dark path. However, before that, let's have a brief overview of what happened, the astonishing story of the rise of Hitler. Before that, I'd like to take a minute to thank the sponsor of today's video, World of Warships. World of Warships is a free-to-play online multiplayer game where you and your teammates work together to vanquish the enemy fleet. Join the battle as we commemorate the heroes of D-Day in World of Warships with a special 80th anniversary event. Engage in epic naval warfare as you relive history's most pivotal moments on the seas. Command new legendary vessels, strategize with your fleet in new missions, and dominate the waves in thrilling battles inspired by the events of June the 6th, 1944. Participate in exclusive in-game events, unlock commemorative rewards, and pay homage to those who changed the course of history. You can look forward to new content like this every single month, whether it's new ships, nations, classes, or cosmetics. And did I mention that World of Warships is also available on console? Download World of Warships by using the link in the description. During registration, use the code DDAY80th to get for free 200 doubloons, 1 million credits, 7 days of premium account time, a free ship after you complete 15 battles, and 3 times the special D-Day missions after 9 battles. In 1914, Europe was at the pinnacle of its power. The past century had been relatively peaceful, allowing for levels of prosperity and technological progress never before seen in human history. Then, seemingly for no reason at all, Europe decided to tear itself apart. It decided to destroy what it had spent so long building. That was the First World War, the biggest war in human history up until that point. Germany, the most powerful country on the mainland, found itself fighting the combined forces of the British, French and Russian empires. Eventually, after 4 years of bloodshed, the German military was overwhelmed and forced to request an armistice. The defeat in the war caused huge instability in German politics as it was forced to abolish its monarchy and become a republic. Even worse, it was left deeply humiliated by the peace treaty that it was forced to sign, the Treaty of Versailles. That made numerous humiliating demands that Germany had no choice but to accept. It had to cede almost 15% of its territory and pay huge reparations to its former enemies that it could scarcely afford. It was forced to give up its colonial empire and essentially disband its glorious military. To all intents and purposes, Germany had been relegated to be a second-class state. As you can imagine, that caused huge resentment in the population. Much of that anger was directed at the new government, and there were numerous attempts to topple it from power. First, the German communists tried to take advantage of protests in Berlin to bring about a revolution. That attempt to take power did fail, but there would be numerous others over the next few years. In 1920, conservatives tried to take power and re-establish the monarchy, but that too failed. Political instability was far from the only problem at the time. Germany was also facing economic chaos. The government was essentially bankrupt and unable to pay the reparations that it was meant to. It resorted to printing money to pay its debts, which led to hyperinflation. At that point, barely anyone in Germany had heard the name Adolf Hitler. Hitler was essentially a nobody at that point. He had fought in the First World War, and after the war he'd got involved in a very small political group called the German Workers' Party. There he honed his talent for public speaking and found other people that shared his far-right views. Eventually, in 1923, amidst the political and economic instability, Hitler would launch his own violent attempt to take power. It was known as the Beer Hall Putsch, and it totally failed. In fact, it was a complete farce. The failed coup landed Hitler in prison for a year, during which he wrote his book Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle. For the rest of the 1920s, Hitler and the Nazis continued trying to win support, but with the economic and political situation improving, few Germans were interested. For example, there was an election in 1928 and the Nazis gained only 2.6% of the vote. Hitler may well have remained a fringe figure in German politics had it not been for the onset of the Great Depression in 1930. The Depression affected Germany brutally, with millions made homeless and left without enough to eat. The disaster turned out to be a godsend for Hitler. Over the next few years, the Nazi Party grew and grew, and by 1932 it had about a third of the seats in the German parliament. That made Hitler the leader of the biggest party. However, he was still far from having absolute power. To get more power, he wanted to be made Chancellor, but for that to happen, he would need to persuade the President. The President at the time was Paul von Hindenburg, who had been one of the most important commanders of World War I and was a hero to many. Hindenburg was concerned by the extremism of Hitler and was reluctant to make him Chancellor. However, there was a big problem in German politics at the time, which was that none of the parties were able to get a majority in Parliament. It was impossible to get anything done. Eventually, after months of political gridlock, Hindenburg gave in and made Hitler Chancellor. Hitler was one step closer to becoming dictator, but there were still checks on his power. There were only 2 Nazis in the cabinet, the rest were normal conservatives. Also, Hindenburg was still president and so could, theoretically, dismiss Hitler whenever he wanted. What eventually gave Hitler absolute power was a complete stroke of luck. On the 27th of February 1932, less than 1 month after he'd been made Chancellor, a communist set fire to the German Parliament building, the Reichstag. Hitler used that to call for emergency powers. He said that communists were an existential threat and that he needed to be given total power to protect Germany. Hindenburg, now very old and doddery, agreed to sign away his power to Hitler. Finally, on the 23rd of March, 1 month after the fire, the German Parliament passed the Enabling Act, which saw Hitler given absolute power. Hitler would remain dictator of Germany for the next 12 years. So, that is what happened, the rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. In this video, I'd like to focus on 6 main ideas that I think were key in that astonishing transformation of Germany into a totalitarian state. The first is just how weak the German state was after World War I. Towards the end of the war, Germany basically fell apart. There were tons of protests, strikes, uprisings. Essentially, it was complete chaos. The majority of people, both the public and the elites, wanted the emperor to abdicate, and he did in November of 1918. Germany then became a republic, what is known as the Weimar Republic. Now, the main thing that you need to know about the Weimar Republic is that it was extremely weak and had several fatal flaws. Essentially, it was doomed to failure from the start. So what were those fatal flaws? The first was that nobody really had any loyalty to it. Nobody was committed to its success. Some people, particularly conservatives and the military, wanted to bring the monarchy back. Others wanted a full-on communist revolution like there had been in Russia. One of the main reasons that the Weimar Republic was so unpopular was that it was associated with the loss in World War I. Up until the very end of World War I, the German people actually thought that they were going to win it. The papers were constantly telling them that they were on the verge of victory right through 1918. Then, all of a sudden, they were told that they had lost, the emperor had gone, and there was a totally new government. Many people didn't actually believe that Germany had been defeated on the battlefield. They thought they must have been betrayed at the last minute by disloyal politicians or Jews. As you can imagine, given that the sudden and confusing bad news happened at the same time as the birth of the Weimar Republic, the two were inextricably linked in people's minds. The new form of government would forever be associated with shame, defeat, and humiliation. Another factor was that the Germans viewed this new form of government as having been imposed on them. It had actually been a demand of American President Woodrow Wilson that they get rid of the emperor. Essentially, the Germans didn't feel that they had chosen to get rid of the monarchy. They felt like they had been forced to. Even for those that weren't staunch monarchists, the abdication of the emperor became a symbol of Germany being forced to bow to the demands of foreign nations. On top of those problems, the Weimar Republic was born in an impossible economic situation. Essentially, throughout the war, Germany had borrowed a huge amount of money to pay for the war effort. World War I had been funded almost entirely by debt. Their plan was that when they won the war, they would get reparations and be able to use those reparations to pay off their debts. Of course, Germany didn't win the war, so rather than receiving reparations, they found themselves paying them instead. The government was in an impossible financial situation, and it resorted to something that so many governments have over the years: printing money. That did what it always does: it caused runaway inflation. It's hard for us now to fathom just how much prices increased in the early 1920s. A loaf of bread that cost around 160 marks at the end of 1922 cost 200 billion marks a year later. At the worst of the hyperinflation, prices were doubling every 4 days. The madness was described by one German writer who wrote about his experience in a cafe. He wrote, "One fine day I dropped into a cafe to have a coffee. As I went in, I noticed the price was 5,000 marks, just about what I had in my pocket. I sat down, read my paper, drank my coffee, and spent about 1 hour in the cafe, and then asked for the bill. The waiter duly presented me with a bill for 8,000 marks. Why 8,000 marks, I asked. The mark had dropped in the meantime, I was told. I gave the waiter all the money I had, and he was generous enough to leave it at that." The inflation had a terrible effect on the German public. Anyone with any savings at all immediately saw them made worthless. As you can imagine, that caused huge unrest and political instability. Overall, the Weimar Republic couldn't have started life with a worse economic inheritance. One final problem that the young republic had was that its constitution had some major flaws. The most glaring was Article 48, that allowed the president to declare a state of emergency and give himself dictatorial powers. Crucially, it was the president alone that would decide whether an emergency actually existed. As you can imagine, the rule quickly began to be abused. The first president used it to give himself dictatorial powers 136 times in only 6 years. It was through the use of Article 48 that Hitler himself would eventually make himself dictator. Overall, the Weimar Republic had numerous problems from day one that meant that it was always unlikely that it was going to survive. Number 2. Violence had been normalized by the First World War. World War I was extremely hard for Germany. About 1.7 million German men had died fighting, which was more than either Britain or France. Their civilian population had been particularly hard hit. The British had employed a naval blockade around Germany, preventing the importation of food. That blockade led to widespread hunger, and almost 500,000 German civilians starved to death. All that means that when the war ended, there was a huge amount of collective trauma. That manifested in all sorts of ways, but one of the most important was that it increased the overall level of violence in society. Huge numbers of people joined paramilitary groups that would regularly fight with each other in the streets. For example, in one day in 1919, tens of thousands of right-wing paramilitaries clashed with about 30,000 communists in the city of Munich. Explosions rocked the city and gunfire echoed through the streets as men with guns engaged in pitched battles for control of the most important buildings. That sort of violence was happening regularly at the time. There were many paramilitary groups, and most had extremist politics of the far left or far right. Those thugs didn't just want to brawl with each other in chaotic street violence, they also tried to seize power through coups. In fact, there were numerous attempts by various different groups to take power. One of the biggest paramilitaries of the far left was the Spartacus League. They were essentially Germany's answer to the Bolsheviks in Russia, wanting a full-on communist revolution. They made their attempt to take power in January of 1919. About 700,000 people were protesting on the streets of Berlin, demanding new elections. The Spartacus League tried to turn that enormous protest into a revolution. However, most of the protesters didn't support the violence and the extremism of the Spartacus League. The coup attempt failed and its two main leaders were killed. In fact, that attempted coup was primarily crushed by another paramilitary, a right-wing paramilitary, the Freikorps. The Freikorps was made up of men that had fought in World War I, and at one point the group was absolutely enormous, almost 2 million strong. Their main goal was preventing a communist takeover of Germany. There were various other attempted coups around that time. In 1920, there was an attempt known as the Kapp Putsch. It happened when the government demanded that the Freikorps be disbanded, something that was completely unacceptable to the higher-ups in the military. Those military officials demanded the fall of the government and new elections. On the 13th of March, they occupied several government buildings, forcing the cabinet to flee Berlin. However, the coup had little popular support. The government in exile called for a general strike and 12 million workers obliged. Germany was paralysed and the coup plotters were forced to give in and accept the return of the previous government. The Nazis also had a paramilitary and they would use that to launch their own coup attempt. The paramilitary of the Nazi party was the SA, which is often called many different things. You sometimes hear it called the Stormtroopers or the Brown Shirts. In 1923, the Nazis would make their own attempt to take power through force in what came to be known as the Beer Hall Putsch. Hitler and members of the SA stormed a beer hall in Bavaria where an important politician was giving a speech. Hitler declared the formation of a new government and demanded the support of the officials present. Initially, they agreed, but later on withdrew their support. The next day, Hitler and his followers marched through Munich and tried to seize key government buildings. However, the police confronted them and what followed was a brief but violent clash in which 20 people died. Ultimately, the Nazis were defeated and failed to take power. Those are only some of the various coup attempts that happened around that time. As you can see, political violence had been normalised and it made for an incredibly unstable situation. Number 3. The Great Depression. It would be impossible to talk about the rise of Hitler without mentioning the Great Depression. By the end of the 1920s, the Nazi Party was reasonably established, but it was still very small, far from being a major force in German politics. For example, there was an election in 1928 and the Nazis got only 2.6% of the vote. I think it's very important to keep in mind that despite all the things I've talked about thus far, despite the resentment over losing the war, despite the hyperinflation, despite the unpopularity of the government, Hitler was still a fringe figure in Germany. I think he likely would have remained that had it not been for the Great Depression. Numerous countries all over the world were affected by the Great Depression, but Germany was particularly hard hit because it was very reliant on money from American banks. Essentially, the German government had borrowed tons of money from the US to help it pay the reparations. That meant that when the Great Depression started in the 1930s, those American banks wanted to get all their money back and pulled it out of Germany. Eventually, the crisis in Europe really got bad when several huge European banks went bankrupt. The resulting economic hardship was absolutely astonishing. 1 in 3 German workers became unemployed. The vast majority of those people didn't get any unemployment benefits, so they quickly fell into poverty. Enormous numbers of people turned to crime and prostitution just to get enough money for food. As you can imagine, that had a huge impact on politics. The government became deeply unpopular as it was forced to cut spending and increase taxes. Particularly unpopular were cuts to unemployment benefits, which affected a lot of people because so many people had lost their jobs. The Nazis and the Communists were able to capitalize on that unpopularity, calling the German Chancellor the Hunger Chancellor. In their state of desperation, much of the population was driven to the far left or far right. For example, membership of the Communist Party trebled in 3 years. For Hitler, that was all fantastic. 1930 saw the first election in which he got a decent share of the vote. The Nazi vote had been 2.6% in 1928. In 1930, it jumped to 18%. Hitler was getting closer to power. Number 4. The campaigning techniques of the Nazis. It's one of the great ironies of the rise of the Nazis that while their goal was to destroy democracy, they were actually very good at elections. They pioneered all sorts of new campaigning techniques that had never been seen before. They took advantage of all the new technologies of the time, such as using microphones and loudspeakers to have more impact at their rallies. They even chartered planes for Hitler to fly from city to city, something unheard of at the time. That enabled him to speak at almost 200 rallies and speak to more than 10 million people. Hitler was also a masterful propagandist. In the early 1920s, when the Nazi Party was still small, he managed to produce thousands of newspapers to increase the membership and spread the word. He knew how to communicate with the masses using simplified language to make his message more understandable. In his own words, all effective propaganda must limit itself to only a few points and to use them like slogans. Nazi propagandists also developed the technique known today as niche marketing. Essentially, they tailored different messages to different audiences, something unheard of at the time. To achieve that, they conducted public opinion research to determine what issues were most important to local voters and adjusted their message accordingly. Of course, one of Hitler's biggest assets was his talent as a public speaker. His speeches would last for hours and have been compared to Wagnerian operas. He would start the speech with low intensity and gradually it would get more and more dramatic and impassioned until by the end he was shouting. By building the intensity gradually, he would take the audiences with him, slowly working them into a frenzy. The Nazi message was to promise everything to everyone, while of course not giving any details about how they would achieve it. Hitler was also very good at taking advantage of all of the resentment at the time. People were angry about the fact that they'd been blamed for World War I. They were angry about being forced to pay reparations that they could barely afford. Throughout the 1920s, there were even more humiliations of Germany, such as when France occupied the Ruhr in 1923. All that resentment meant that people were open to Hitler's hateful rhetoric. His talent for angry, hateful speeches made it easy for him to get the votes of all those that were bitter and cynical. He did that most famously by using the Jews as a scapegoat, blaming them for the loss of World War I. Number 5. The mistakes and division of the opposition. Hitler could have been stopped. There is absolutely no doubt about that. Even towards the end, when he was on the verge of absolute power, the opposition could still have stopped him if they'd worked together. Unfortunately, they were too incompetent and divided to do so and made numerous terrible mistakes. One mistake that the establishment politicians made repeatedly was to call elections when they didn't need to. The first example of that was the election in September of 1930. That was only 2 years after the previous election, so it wasn't a requirement to hold it. What is crucial to understand is that the Great Depression had started in the intervening 2 years, which made the government hugely unpopular. They did the election because they were finding it impossible to get any laws through the parliament. The decision will prove a disaster. The Nazi vote went from 2.6% to 18%. It was a terrible, unforced error. There was no requirement to hold the election, and it should have been obvious that the centre politicians were hugely unpopular due to the Depression. In July of 1923, the establishment politicians made the same mistake again when they called another election. That time the Nazis won 37% of the vote, making them the largest party. It's easy to ask why the establishment politicians kept calling elections, even when there was this growing threat from the Nazis. One important reason is that they totally underestimated them. They basically viewed the Nazis as violent clowns and didn't take them seriously. Another important reason is that there was political gridlock in the parliament. It was impossible to get a majority to get anything through, so they kept calling elections in the hope that there would be a decisive majority. Unfortunately, that didn't work. With the election in July of 1932, Hitler now led the biggest party in the German parliament, and so he demanded to be made Chancellor. What happened next could and should have been the end of him. Hitler met with President Hindenburg and demanded to be made Chancellor, but Hindenburg refused. He said that he wouldn't allow a party so extreme and willing to use violence into power. Ultimately, that could have been the end for Hitler. If President Hindenburg was never going to allow him to become Chancellor, then there really wasn't much hope of him gaining power. What came to his rescue was again the fact that politics was paralysed and the division of those that opposed him. With nobody able to get a majority in the parliament, it raised the obvious question of how was Germany going to be governed. For months, Germany remained in that stasis and the politicians of the centre struggled to agree on anything. They actually tried another election in November of 1932, but still the problem remained. After months of gridlock, President Hindenburg, who had refused to make Hitler Chancellor, gradually became more and more open to the idea. Eventually, Hindenburg and his political ally, Franz von Papen, decided that they would allow Hitler to become Chancellor, but he would only have 2 Nazis in the cabinet. Once again, they had underestimated Hitler, thinking that they would be able to control him. Papen was to be Hitler's vice-chancellor, which he thought would allow him to be in control. He thought that Hitler was essentially a violent thug and that his inexperience would make him easy to manipulate. In fact, when he was asked how he was willing to put Hitler in power, Papen responded, "You are wrong, we have hired him." Papen, Hindenburg and the other centre-right politicians thought that they were using Hitler as a pawn in their chess game. In fact, it was they that were the pawns. Number 6. Fear of communism. All throughout those years in the early 1930s, one of the key things that helped Hitler was the fear of communism. Essentially, the German people had seen what had happened in the communist revolution in Russia, and they were terrified of the same thing happening in Germany. To make those fears worse, Germany's Communist Party was getting more and more of the vote with each passing election. That meant that for many in the population, the Nazis, while scary, were the lesser of 2 evils. I think to understand that, you need to remember just how bad things were in Russia during the Communist Revolution. There had been a brutal civil war that killed about 10 million people. The communist policies had caused a famine that killed about 5 million people. From the very beginning, there had been class-based genocide, with the poorest in society encouraged to kill and rob the middle and upper classes. As you can imagine, everyone in Germany with any degree of wealth was terrified. Regarding the rise of Hitler, the fear of communism really made a difference towards the end in the early 1930s. Part of the reason that the centrist politicians were willing to work with Hitler was because of the threat of communism. It was also key in allowing Hitler to get absolute power. Once he was made Chancellor, Hitler was very powerful, but there were still some limitations. There were only 2 other Nazis in the cabinet, and theoretically he could be dismissed at any moment by President Hindenburg. What allowed Hitler to take total power was the Reichstag fire in February of 1933. Hitler used the fire to create a climate of fear that there was going to be a communist uprising at any minute. He persuaded President Hindenburg to issue the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended many civil liberties, including freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to assembly. The decree also allowed for the detention of political opponents without trial, effectively giving the Nazi paramilitaries the freedom to arrest their rivals. They arrested thousands of communists, including elected members of the Communist Party of Germany. However, the Nazis didn't stop with just communists. They quickly abused the law and began intimidating and harassing anyone that they wanted to. That severely weakened the Communist Party, and so Hitler then called another election with the intention of killing them off once and for all. The Nazis won 44% of the vote in that election, so still not enough for an absolute majority. To go that last step and achieve absolute power, Hitler needed to get a bill passed known as the Enabling Act. That would give him the power to enact laws without the approval of Parliament, essentially making him dictator. He used both fear of communism and intimidation to force the other parties to vote for it. The communists were banned from Parliament, and many of the other deputies were in fear of their lives. On the 23rd of March, the Enabling Act was passed with a 2/3 majority. With that, the last real opportunity to stop Hitler had been lost. Over the next few months, the Nazis gradually consolidated their hold on power, banning the other parties and suppressing dissent. Hitler now had absolute power and would use it to take Germany into the darkest moments of its history. So, those are my 6 things that brought Hitler to power. The weakness of the Weimar Republic, the rise of violence after World War I, the Great Depression, the Nazis' skill with elections, the mistakes of the opposition, and the fear of communism. It goes without saying that there are numerous other things that I could have mentioned, such as the influence of Mussolini in Italy or Europe's long history of anti-Semitism. That said, I hope I have managed to get across the most important parts of the story. We can only hope that humanity has learned its lesson and that the same mistakes will never again be repeated. Thanks again to World of Warships for sponsoring the video. Click the link in the description and use promo code DDAY80th to get 200 doubloons, 1 million credits, 7 days of premium account time, a free ship after you complete 15 battles, and 3 times the number of special D-Day missions after 9 battles.